Dr. Rupy, welcome back on the pod. A pleasure to have you here. I'm going to jump right into things. You have screamed on the rooftops to help the world understand the unique corner that you occupy, that 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, unfortunately, is deeply tied to poor diet. That's almost 11 million excess deaths a year that are tied to poor diet, bad nutrition, etc. Super unfortunate. I heard a quote from you from a podcast where you said that if I can help people eat well consistently, and that's the key word, that's the number one thing that I can do personally, you as Dr. Rupy, to make a dent in that number. I'm curious, from your perspective, as both a doctor who also has a deep background now in nutrition, what gets in the way of that word consistently? Yeah. What's going on in people's lives that they can't consistently show up and eat in a way that actually serves their body and their health?
Yeah, a great question. And I'm fascinated by the same barriers, right? And so we actually did a deep dive into our newsletter community. We sent out a questionnaire. We had about 4,000 responses, and it detailed what people's individual issues were with regards to how they can't consistently eat well. And it ranges from things like access to food, the cost of healthy foods, or the perceived cost of healthy foods, I should say, because I think there's definitely ways around that. And then culinary creativity, actually, that was one thing that came up consistently. It was, I don't know what to do with a pepper or a broccoli, or I don't like the taste of those, or I don't think I like the taste of those. So those things kept on coming up as well as the fact that people aren't really, this doesn't apply to our newsletter community as much, but people aren't really aware of the magnitude of effect that food can have on their health, not in just a preventative manner, but also in a management perspective as well. So when people go to the doctor and they're diagnosed with high cholesterol, or they have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, the inclination is to have a drug to suit that, to treat that initially. Whereas there is so much scope for using food as the initial tool in our toolbox of different things that we can have, whether it be lifestyle related, pharmaceutical related, diet related, and it's not explored as much. And there are reasons for that as well. I mean, I, as a doctor, when I went to med school 20 years ago now, we weren't taught about nutrition. We weren't taught about the concepts of nutritional medicine. So there are some systemic reasons as to why we're not taught, and hence the culture amongst people is not one of one that appreciates food as medicine. So this is, I mean, that quote is something that I'm super passionate about, and I'm trying to get more people to understand the magnitude of effect that food can have, and the need for it to be consistent as well. So if I can figure out a way in which to create an environment whereby health is the default, i.e. it's the default option to have a healthy option, not something that you have to opt into, usually at a premium, then that's something that I think will have a vast effect, and something that fulfills my mission really of being a doctor.
Absolutely. And you're working on that. We're going to talk a little bit about that and the app and everything. So I mentioned to you before we started recording here that I also was very curious that from your perspective, again, as a doctor, but also having this background now in nutrition, piggybacking off this question of consistency, what do you think are things in the current state of the world of health, wellness, that you think are underrated and overrated?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about first underrated.
Yeah.
And let's zoom out beyond poor nutrition and diet.
Yeah.
And let's just talk about the category of health.
Yeah.
Right? What is underrated that you've doubled down on, and that you even more, like the years that you've been doing your thing now, your ideas have been stress tested and you feel like this is just as important as ever. So what's underrated from your perspective?
Yeah, I think generally, and this probably doesn't apply to your audience who is generally going to be quite educated in nutrition, but looking at the landscape and speaking to the patients that I see on a day-to-day basis, it's fiber. It's honestly fiber. It's so underrated. It's not funny. a lot of people are coming around to this idea now of gut health. And I think the sexy option is to go for probiotics or specific prebiotic supplements. But actually, fiber in whole foods is phenomenally underrated, and it's so easy to get as well from your local supermarket, wherever you are in the country or the world. And just consuming more fiber in the form of whole foods has a drastic effect on health. It improves your microbiota, as we all know. That has an impact on things like short-chain fatty acid generation that can support not just the intestines and the colon walls, but also your inflammation, sugar levels, your gut-brain axis. So it actually has a magnificent effect on your brain and your mental well-being. And just that simple increase in fiber can have an incredible effect. So I think personally, whole foods that contain fiber is something that's massively underrated.
You know what's interesting? You said it may not apply to my audience.
Yeah.
Right. Or let's say, my audience, your audience, probably very similar for the people that are listening. I've actually found that for a lot of people, even if they've been in the world of health for a while, you kind of forget about the basics. There'll be a life event or things that are happening, and maybe you're not consistently getting the right amount of sleep, for example, right? Which you talk about a lot as well. And you forget, and it's so easy to get caught up in the new thing, and you deprioritize the basics. So I think constantly people have to, in a way, fight to make sure the basics are priority.
Yeah.
And when it comes to fiber, here's what I've noticed in America in particular, and we're recording this in London, and I'm sure it's similar, but it's maybe not to the extreme that it is in America. In the wellness and health world in America, we are suffering from the same thing that happened to unhealthy foods, which is that a lot of the wellness foods, quote unquote, that people find themselves eating are just processed foods.
Yeah.
And it's easy for them to be the same things as the quote unquote unhealthy foods that we talk about because they're packaged. So they're low in fiber, they're high in sugar or refined carbohydrates, they're high in, again, fat, but maybe low in fiber. And you end up having this place where you are thinking that you're eating a healthy diet. And there's nothing wrong with having some packaged foods here and there, but you look up and you're like, oh shit, a lot of my foods are coming from processed, quote unquote, wellness products.
Yeah.
And even those people can fall into the trap of, wow, why am I feeling a little bit more constipated?
Yeah.
Why is my gut not feeling really good right now? Oh, okay. I missed out on one of the basics. I'm not having enough fiber in my diet.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad we're talking about this actually, because I think there is this notion that it's expected if you listen to the right podcast and if you're cognizant of your diet and you choose the quote unquote health labeled products that you're living a healthy lifestyle, it's actually quite basic. And the lack of cooking proficiency, I think, is also another barrier for people to actually get involved and indulge themselves in foods that are going to be helping their well-being. And fiber is a massive part, like I just said, with the impact on the microbiota, massive. When you start consuming wellness products that are usually in packages, and it can be like a bar, it can be a health drink, it can be a pre-packaged healthier alternative to your typical convenience foods. It might be better on the spectrum in terms of, and when I talk about the spectrum on one side, for those who are watching on YouTube, you've got your whole foods that are completely uncooked and raw. And on the other side, you have completely refined foods. And it could be something like, white sugar is a really good example, or a milled refined flour. Across the spectrum of that, the closer you get to whole foods is great. So some healthier foods are definitely better than the ultra refined and ultra processed foods. But really, we want to give ourselves the biggest chance of getting more towards that whole foods as possible. And just a little bit of processing via steaming or lightly cooking is a great way of increasing the bioavailability of all those different ingredients. But most people aren't giving themselves the benefit of that full spectrum of all the different ingredients that you find and all the different elements of whole foods that we can enjoy by just going to our local supermarket and cooking from scratch. And so there is a trap that I see a lot of health conscious people falling into, with indulging in those health labeled products without really getting to the basics. And that's actually where the benefits lie.
Yeah. And I think that it just goes back to the basic core idea of industrialization, is that we're so thankful for it. We're thankful for all this spectrum of foods that are out there. And even the ultra processed foods that are there ultimately started with, good intentions, like when ultra processed foods first came on the market. But fundamentally, any kind of heavy processing across the board that is going to be isolating certain macros, it's just making it easier to overeat on those categories. And because those foods taste great and they're quite addictive, without looking up and taking an inventory of where we're at, it's very easy to overeat on certain categories. We're not here to demonize, sugar. We're not here to demonize fat. We're not here to demonize carbohydrates, but it's just so much easier to overeat when the base of our diet is coming from heavily processed foods.
Yeah. And I just want to double click on that point, actually, because I think there's a number of parallels that we can observe in different areas, right? So the Green Revolution, for example, started decades ago, had great intentions, but the overstretching of industrializing and intensive farming has had negative effects, and that's what's led to increased use of pesticides, the lack of fertility in our soils, the gradual destruction of the elements in our soils that leads to less nutritious foods that I think more and more people are becoming aware of. And the same thing with processing foods. I actually think there are a lot of things that we should be grateful for when it comes to the industrialization of food. It's made it more portable, the shelf life is increased, and palatable, quite frankly, as well. The downside is that you're stripping out a lot of those nutrients. So whilst you're providing food to a lot more people, the quality of that food has taken a hit. And so it really comes down to readdressing the balance. And I don't want to come across as puritanical. Like, whilst I cook the majority of my food, sometimes I still need to eat convenience food. Sometimes I find myself where I haven't eaten, I need to eat something, usually in an airport, and I have to make a choice between different convenience options, none of which I would opt into had I had the choice, or had I, have access to a kitchen that I can quickly prepare something in. So it's a balance of choices, and I think what I aim to do is help navigate people, help to navigate the complex landscape, and make it easier for people to do so.
Yeah, and maybe this is a little bit fast forwarding this, but I think one thing that's definitely overrated that a lot of people are having more of a conversation on is, with all this information that's out there, people having this idea that getting their diet 10% better, which means, for them, like not having, which already maybe for somebody listening to this podcast would be super infrequent, like having a soda or eating, whatever junk food they crave at that time. What might be overrated, what I personally feel, is trying to get that last 10% instead of investing that energy into working out, better sleep, or in some cases, some people just need better community and friends so that they're actually happier and they have the energy to go pursue what their actual dreams are in life. What's your hot take on that?
I totally agree. And it's funny you say this, because I've got a lot of friends who aren't medical and they're really getting into the biohacking space, right? And I think biohacking, apart from the name, I think we could probably come up with a better name. It's definitely introduced a number of things into common culture that perhaps would have been fringe or just completely unknown. Things like sauna, things like cold immersion therapy or cold water therapy and stuff, of which there are many benefits, I feel. But I think until you get to that stage, there are some fundamental basics that we need to get a hold of. And a lot of my friends, they'll spend exorbitant amounts of time getting to a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, or going to a cryo, or taking a specific suite of different supplements. And you just think about the amount of time that we all have given to us in a 24-hour period. How could I optimize my body using the same pockets of time? Would I choose to go into the hyperbaric oxygen chamber? Only if I really had a significant inclination to do so, or I was treating something like a traumatic brain injury, where there is some scanty evidence. Would I opt to do that instead of exercise? Something that doesn't sound as sexy, but has incredible evidence base around the benefits to cardiovascular health, brain health, mental well-being, cognitive ability. I'm definitely going to be going for the exercise. And so I think, jumping ahead to the overrated elements, I think certainly some of those activities are overrated, whereas the underrated is things like exercise. And I ensure every single day there's at least 30 to 40 minutes spent exercising. It can be a whole bunch of different things. It could be flow, it could be HIIT training. It doesn't always need to require a gym. In fact, having a sort of like Swiss Army knife of activities you can do in your lounge is probably one of the best things that you can invest your time into doing. Like creating a smorgasbord of different workouts that you can do in your home without disturbing anyone, and just using a mat or some simple equipment. Honestly, that's probably one of the best life hacks I have. I started doing this thing with my my videographer, because I think one of the other things I think is getting into the mindset and identifying yourself as someone who exercises every day.
Right.
And I think that personal identity piece is part of the puzzle for a lot of people. Like I identify as someone who cooks well and cooks consistently every day. I identify as someone who exercises every day. I identify as someone who goes for a walk every day. And so those things will peter down into my activities on a week by week basis. And so I was chatting to my videographer, and he was trying to get into exercise, and he's done this typical yo-yo exercising activity, like someone who will do a run for an hour a couple of times a week, and then by the next week they're like, I can't really be bothered, or like I'll do it tomorrow, and then ultimately you just put it off, and then you don't exercise anymore. I was like, well, what do you like doing? He's like, I like skipping. It's like, okay, well, what's the minimum amount of time you can spend exercising, skipping every day?
Is that like jumping rope, by the way?
Jumping rope, yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
American audience is imagining this guy skipping around his room. They're like, all right, he likes skipping.
Well, I mean, whatever floats your boat, right? So he was like, jump rope. So he was like, I probably do 15 minutes every day. I was like, 15 minutes, that's quite a lot. 15 minutes is quite a lot of skipping every day. What do you think you can do that every single day, 7 days a week? I was like, oh man, maybe I can do 10 minutes. I was like, we had this back and forth until I whittled it down into 60 seconds. Like, you're going to skip for 60 seconds. You can promise yourself, hand on heart, if you miss a day, you lose 1,000 pounds. Let's put it that way. Really put like some money on the line here. It's like, okay, I can do 60 seconds every day. And now, like, he texts me, it's like, I've skipped for like 30 minutes a day for the last month.
That's amazing.
Because you just get into that mindset of like, I'm the person who skips. And so going back to the underrated, overrated, I think underrated is certainly exercise and simple forms of exercise. Overrated, I think, are the other activities that are certainly interesting, really exciting to hear about and talk about for sure on podcasts and stuff, but perhaps something that is reserved for a little bit later down your wellness journey.
Yeah, or maybe not at all, right?
Maybe, yeah.
But depends on the person that's
Absolutely,
there. But when you have those fundamentals, I think you also, when you identify, and this came later for me, we were chatting this weekend when we were getting together with my wife, and Rungan was there as well too. I didn't grow up in a household where, like most South Asians, where you saw people like working out on a regular basis, right? My brother-in-law, who you've met before, Dr. Neil Patel, he was always, even like in high school, and I kind of knew of him a little bit before him and my sister got married. He was the first person that I saw like really, that was like close to me, like consistently working out, like that was their identity. And I didn't really get the bug. I was inconsistent. I always played sports. I would hike, other things, but like real proper resistance training, I didn't for real get the bug until the last like couple years. And even then, when the pandemic happened and all the gyms closed in California, I really struggled with the whole working out at home thing. I
Yeah.
needed that sort of accountability.
Yeah.
And then last year I started working out with a group that actually started out in the United Kingdom. And they ultimately came to America, and they have a bunch of gyms over there. And I've gotten that identity. It's like part of my routine, at least 4 days a week. And it's become part of who I am.
Yeah.
And the craziest thing is that through doing all these incredible interviews with guests like yourself, you start connecting the dots that even for somebody like me, who's in the wellness space, not as an expert, but as somebody who gets to interview and talk to great people, you start connecting the dots that so many of the things that you're looking for in your diet, or maybe for some people who are listening through some miracle supplement or drug that they're waiting for, that all of those things are deeply connected to something like exercise, for instance. So, you've had on somebody like Jessie, the glucose goddess, before.
Yeah.
I love all the hacks.
Yeah.
She's a great interviewer. She has so many incredible things to teach people that you don't have to completely sacrifice and not enjoy the foods that you want. It's all about sequencing that right order so that you don't have this massive impact of glucose inside of the body all at once, which can have damaging effects. And one thing that I started noticing is I would regularly monitor my fasting insulin, my fasting, my continuous glucose monitoring. And when I started regularly and seriously started going to the gym and practicing resistance training, and also working on getting my VO2 max up and things like that I was tracking, even though my diet from the outside looked like I was having more carbs or more sugar or more this or that, all my numbers started to improve because I was focusing on these core basics. When you increase your strength, your muscle mass increases. When your muscle mass increases, your metabolic health increases, so on and so forth. So I saw this tweet the other day from Sachin Panda and his work, in circadian biology and sleep. And he was tweeting something about sleep. And he was saying that the best insurance, it's a review meta-analysis that came out recently. We'll link to it in the show notes. The best insurance against cancer that's out there is exercise. Like physical workout is the best insurance to significantly reduce your risk of cancer. So how many people listening to this podcast are interested in the topic of, cancer prevention? Might have had somebody in their family, unfortunately, I've had, that maybe either passed of cancer or has cancer now. And when you start pulling back these soft things, even for us in the wellness space, more and more information comes out every single year that these core basics are the key for everything that we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those core basics, as unsexy as they sound, have like incredible pleiotropic effects. And what I mean by that is that they have multimodal effects. It's not just working on your muscles, it's also working on your insulin signaling, it's also working on your cardiovascular health, all these different elements. And I think, to reduce the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I think to belittle the impact of exercise is something that we do quite colloquially. It's something that we generally don't pay enough attention to, just getting the core basics right. And I like to say to patients, like, before you even think about any of the other activities that you could potentially do, whether it be biohacking or sauna or whatever, let's just get the basics such to a level whereby it's become a habit, and that's when you get to go to the next level. You don't get to skip levels as you go ahead. There's an analogy in business, actually, a parallel in business, whereby I heard someone on a podcast and they're talking about paid ads. And there's loads of different things that you can do within business when you're advertising a product or a service or whatever it is. You can put ads on Facebook, you can put ads on Instagram, Google, you can do in-person events, you could do tube ads or metro ads or whatever subway you have in the States. You could put your money in all these different areas, right? But really what you want to do is just focus on one pathway, one vertical where you just do your ads, you optimize those to a point whereby it's working, and then you go into a different ad network or ad service. It's the same thing with how we look after our bodies. You want to optimize your diet, you want to optimize your exercise, and once that's to a level, then you can experiment with all the other things. But don't run forward. Don't go for the supplements. Don't go for the sauna or the cold immersion therapy without really getting the basics right, because that's where all the magic happens. And that's where like my head's at. And going back to the sort of multimodal effects, I want to double down on things that have a multitude of effects. So diet's one, exercise another, sleep we've just mentioned as well. And one of the other things that I think is underrated, I've got quite a few things that are underrated. One of the things that I think is underrated is simply mind wandering. So actually encouraging people to experience boredom, encouraging people to take themselves out of the rat race of looking at your phone or looking at your computer. You know, one of the benefits I think of doing a podcast is that it actually allows you to completely switch off. But one of the benefits of also going for a walk is that you actually increase and enhance creativity. It's a fantastic antidote to the stresses and the burdens of modern day living. And it's something that I think is really underrated and something that I'm trying to experience a lot more of myself. Just taking a walk.
Yeah.
And you know, there are phytochemicals in the air and stuff, and if you are lucky enough to be in a park, there's all these different benefits of forest bathing that a lot of Japanese researchers have been talking about for years. Shirinjuku, I think it's called, which is translated as forest bathing. But I think the effect of mind wandering as an activity can't be overstated enough, particularly in this point in our time where our attention is constantly being grabbed. I had this wonderful conversation with Johan Hari a couple of months ago, who's written a brilliant book called Stolen Focus. And it's all about how technology and the impact of our westernized diets and the impact of our culture is really focused on distracting us. Our attention is constantly being stolen. That's why it's called Stolen Focus. And one of the main things that we can do to encourage creativity, productivity, and space is simply going for a walk without any distractions and being alone. And when I put the spotlight on myself, which is something that I try and do more regularly, I realize that I'm constantly being entertained, whether it's via my AirPods, a podcast. Even when I'm in the gym, I'm entertaining myself whilst I'm in the gym. And I think we need to encourage ourselves to take regular breaks from that, because it's very easy to constantly be consuming information rather than just taking a break from it.
Yeah, and I think that the key word is just taking a break so that you can have that contrast. It's when you take a contrast, when you have a contrast, you have the natural ability to then say, okay, do I need more of this or that? A perfect example, I think like a couple of years ago when I was here, you were taking a coffee break, right? And this is something that I've done before in my own life. And the thing that I love about it, I've written a newsletter about it. We'll link to it in the show notes. The thing I love about a break from coffee, I love coffee. I have some coffee here that I'm drinking right now. But the thing I love about a coffee break is like anything that's quite stimulating, social media, over listening to health information, podcasts, the news, whatever it might be, it's easy for that to become part of our baseline. And we forget what we actually need more of or less of in our life. In particular with coffee, I noticed that amongst my friends, and even for myself, when I haven't taken a break from coffee, I tend to have coffee be one of the first liquids that I indulge in the day.
Right.
Forgetting to drink the amount of water that I need to make sure that I'm actually genuinely rehydrated so I can focus, so I can make sure that I have great bowel movements, so I can make sure all the things that happen with being properly hydrated. And when I was looking at the research, it was nuts. And I wrote all about this. Even a 1% drop in a 1% increase towards dehydration, so a 1% drop in hydration has all these downstream effects inside of the body. But you forget and you can't tell, am I dehydrated or not? Especially, most people wake up, they drink a little bit of water, then they go immediately to get their coffee.
Yeah.
I kind of created this whole challenge, which is called the Morning Hydration Challenge. And it was kind of done to help people understand that actually you don't know how much water you need until you are appropriately hydrated. And then you know you can get the rest of the, amount of hydration you
Totally.
need during the day. So breaks are good because they allow us to reset. And I'm constantly thinking about in my own life, where do I need to create a little bit of boundaries for something so I can reset and appropriately, get back to my true baseline of health.
Totally, yeah. Two points on that. So I still do my coffee breaks at least once a year for 30 days. I really enjoy them. I think it's really important to take a break from anything that is stimulating. In that case, it's caffeine. I love the taste of coffee. I'm a proper coffee nerd. I only drink like really good quality coffee that's free of pesticides and molds and all the rest of it. And there's a particular brand that I drink they source beans from a high altitude because the crops are stressed a bit more. It's the hormetic effect. And so the coffee is actually grown to have higher amounts of polyphenols, which have those benefits that are transferred to us. So things like allergic acid, caffeic acids, all these different phytochemicals that provide benefits to us are heightened in the coffee, and they also medium roast as well, so as not to reduce the polyphenol content again. And they also have a decaf version, so I drink that for a month. And they take it out by the Swiss water method, which isn't using any chemicals or harsh extractants. So I drink that for a month, and the first couple of days is terrible. Actually, I do get those withdrawals. I only drink 2 coffees a day generally, and I usually have one at the weekend. So I'm not like a prolific coffee drinker, and certainly not after 12 p.m. for me, because I've got slow half-life as a result of my my genotype. But during that time period, I kind of proved to myself that I can live without this stimulant on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's important as well. Like, I'm not reliant on any one thing, and I would just have like a decaffeinated tea as well during that 30-day period. And I think it's important for everyone to sort of stress themselves in that way at least once a year, so you're not reliant on one thing. And the second point about hydration, I think it's another underrated thing. A lot of people reach for a coffee in the afternoons because they feel that they need that pick-me-up. Whereas in actual fact, if you listen to your body, generally it's because of dehydration in a lot of cases. We don't tend to consume enough water. And when you just think about the volume of our bodies as water, it's a huge amount. It's anywhere between 55 and 70% of our body weight. And so those small fluctuations in our hydration status can manifest in things like poor cognitive ability or feeling fatigued. And without having to do specific clinical tests like turgor pressure when you pinch your skin, or looking at your tongue, or blood pressure, or any of those fluctuations, just simply looking at the color of your urine and ensuring that it's straw colored is a really good indicator of light straw colored is a really good indicator of your hydration status. I had a conversation with 2 urologists actually on the podcast, specifically about renal stones. And the number one reason as to why people precipitate renal stones is because of poor hydration, which is why you see a peak of renal stones, kidney stones, in summer months, because we're not drinking enough and we're expelling and excreting water through sweat.
I think the best thing about, long format podcasts, social media, and the current state of the world is when, in a new way that maybe somebody hasn't heard before, also maybe hearing it from somebody that looks like them or they feel like they could relate to, or somebody, in your case, who's like a young, handsome doctor, it's like, wow, this thing that my mom, my friend, my person has been telling me, it's like I'm hearing it in a new way that gets me excited about doing it.
Yeah.
And when we can take those basics and almost in a way sort of be the cheerleader for the basics, like that's the best expression of social media, long form podcasts, because generally those basics are going to be low cost or no cost.
Totally.
And it's a slight modification on things that we're already spending time and money on, but we're going to get so much more value out of them. I'm going to toss out one, I know you have a few more things on the underrated.
Yeah.
I'm going to toss in a couple.
Yeah, go for it, man.
And I'd love to get your thoughts on them as well.
Totally.
So one thing that I think is underrated that I started doing last year as part of my workout training program, and I think is a very controversial thing for some people, but I think actually a good thing to do for a period of time is actually tracking your calories.
Yeah.
And as somebody who is in the world of wellness, where so many people come on my podcast and are saying like, you know, a calorie of broccoli is not the same as, you know, a calorie of Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Yes, of course that's true. You know, calories are not just calories. And yet, because we live in this world of processed foods and ultra processed foods, even in the health industry, you end up, because these foods are so hyper palatable, overeating on things that you have no idea on and under-eating on certain things that you also have no idea on.
Yeah.
Like fiber, for example.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have no freaking clue how much fiber they're having.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not talking about calories just for body composition and weight. Although if somebody is struggling with that and they feel like they've been doing a lot of the basics that are there, I do think it's an area to look at.
Yeah.
Right? Energy balance and total consumption of calories does have an impact on weight that's there. And for people in the health industry in particular, I think that they would benefit so much for at least like 2 to 3 weeks of tracking their calories, looking at a few big things, looking at sugar, carbohydrates, looking at fat, looking at protein, and to look at where they might be just based on however they want to eat, whatever their diet is, whether they're vegan or they want to do a ketogenic diet or this or that, to actually see is how they're eating, even as a first layer, matching how they think that they're eating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
Not even telling you what you should eat or what you shouldn't eat.
Yeah.
Is it matching that based on the food that you're eating? One thing that I found last year is that, in particular for me, somebody who grew up vegetarian and then was vegan for like 7 years, that even though I don't eat that way now, people can eat however they want to, I was significantly under eating on protein.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have thought that was the case because I had stopped being vegetarian and vegan, which obviously you can get proteins, you know, through plant sources. And there's great resources that we've talked about in the past on that. But I was so significantly under eating on protein that I had no clue until I started tracking. So that is something that obviously there's a lot of layers to that. And, you know, but I think in the wellness world in particular, it's a good thing to do for a specific amount of time just to get an understanding of where you're actually eating from. For a lot of my friends right now who swear, like you hear this sort of this, you know, you hear this a lot from people saying, I've literally been trying everything. And I have a friend right now, a dear close friend of mine. He's like, yeah, man, like, you know, I've been doing everything. I've been doing this, that. I can't actually, in his particular case, he does want to lose some weight and drop, you know, improve his body composition. I was like, genuinely, like, have you actually tracked the total quantity of fat that you're eating? Because it's so easy to overeat on fat.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're demonizing fat. There's plenty of healthy fats that are out there. But in particular for him, I thought that might have been something. And as he started tracking, he saw that he was astonished to see, just from a couple of processed foods here or there, the total quantity of fat that he was having. And just by changing that by about 10 to 15%, he actually was able to start to lose a little bit of weight, you know, in combination with him working out and all this other stuff that he was doing previously. So I think calorie tracking is something that I would say is underrated for a temporary period of time.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
I'm
that?
going to give you my hot takes on that. So this definitely parallels to the other thing that I was going to talk about, which is underrated, which paradoxically is wearables and tracking in general. Because what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And I think there's definitely benefits for a whole bunch of different metrics that we can measure for a short amount of time. Calories, I feel like I've gone full circle around on this, right? So before, when I was at med school, everything was about calories. It was about macros, calories, muscle building, you know, basically the men's health version of nutrition school. That's basically like was my knowledge of calories. And I was like drinking the calorie Kool-Aid. That was me. It was all about calories. And then when you start learning a bit about the absorbable calories from different types of foods, the impact on your insulin response, on the other markers that lead to weight loss and weight gain, calories diminish in their importance. That was, I think, pretty fashionable now today to think of calories as not mattering at all within the wellness space. I think there is a really nice middle ground, which you've articulated beautifully, in that calories do matter to an extent, but there is a lot of variation between how one consumes food and how they absorb the calories from said food. And so our ability to absorb the energy from nuts is going to be different based on our microbiota, based on our current weight status, based on our stresses and the hormone levels. But as a general rule of thumb, understanding the total calories consumed in a 24-hour period over a couple of weeks, I think does have those tangible benefits because it gives you a ballpark idea of just how much energy you are consuming as an individual. And so for a period of time, whether it be a couple of weeks, I think it is good to note that. And actually, this is something I did a couple of years ago. And I realized I was actually consuming quite a bit of calories. It was around 3,000 calories per day, but I was also exercising quite a bit. So it kind of matched out. And that's why I wasn't having big fluctuations in my weight. During COVID, on the other hand, I was working in hospital pretty much full time. And what did I do when I came home? I'd reach for sugary items because I was comfort eating. I'd be having a lot more alcoholic drinks, probably to take the stress off a bit, not like a huge amount, but a wine or two a night, which is a lot more than I drink right now, which is pretty much rarely. And all those things definitely have an impact. And it is certainly true to say certain foods with their calorie content will have more of a detrimental impact on your body. You know, outside of the calorie counts itself, the sugar content, the form in which the food is being consumed, whether it be through a sugar sweetened beverage, it's impossible to compare like a can of soda with a broccoli in calorie for calorie. I think that's a very naive way of looking at it. But there are merits to understanding your general calorie balance. And I think another thing that is underrated is the food matrix. And that's where the calorie counting alone doesn't really provide as much information as it should do. And the food matrix, just to give a very crude example, is a whole nut versus pounded nuts or like a nut powder versus a smooth like nut butter. Those are going to have different impacts on your body in terms of the absorbability of the fats into your bloodstream and the absorbability of the energy contained within the nut itself. You're going to absorb less of the calories in its whole form than you are in the smooth nut butter form. And that over time will have an impact. So I agree. I think counting calories for a small amount of time to give you a general ballpark figure whilst appreciating the food matrix and whilst appreciating the quality of those calories gives people a better, a richer understanding, particularly if they are interested in weight gain, weight loss, and weight maintenance.
Absolutely. We're surrounded by energy in the form of food, which is always available to us. And our genetics are programmed and our biology is programmed to seek this out.
Yeah.
And because we have so much abundance around us in largely the Western world, which is being exported all around the world, even to countries like India, where they're dealing with obesity and diabetes, it's super fast growing. So this is a global problem now, energy abundance. And in a way, if we don't take inventory, it's just too easy to let our palate dictate.
Yeah.
Especially if our diet is still, focused on a lot of processed foods.
And I think, the discussion around calories does lack nuance on both sides, right? So from the health professional point of view, it doesn't appreciate the benefits of calorie counting to give people an overall picture of what their diet is, particularly if they're interested in weight loss or weight gain. And on the flip side, typically personal trainers, gym goers, people who are in the bodybuilding community, they probably overstate the use of calories to, magnify the impact on things like type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, insulin resistance. We can't just look at calories in isolation. There is nuance to this. There is like a middle way that I think, your podcast and long form conversation in general adds a lot more color to the discussion that is otherwise lost in like a tweet or a headline or, someone talking about it in a 15-second clip on Instagram or TikTok. And I think just to add a little bit more clarity to the calorie discussion, a calorie deficit 100% helps people lose weight. Absolutely. There's no way in which anyone can argue that. But there are degrees in which you can tailor your calorie deficit to improve the long-term goal, which is weight loss over a longer time period. So if you were to drastically drop your calories, let's say by 20%, your body literally goes into starvation mode, and you'll find that typical plateau around 90 days, whereby you don't lose any more weight because your body is literally fighting losing any more weight. And then what typically happens is when you eat according to your normal diet prior to when you went on the calorie deficit diet, is you actually increase your weight. And this is a well-known phenomenon. No one really can argue against this. And that's why I think there are benefits in something called interval weight loss, which is where you reduce your calories by a very, very small amount. You experience and coast out that plateau. And then when your body is adjusted to that, then you reduce it slightly again if you're trying to get to a lower weight maintenance point. That is less sexy because it's not like you can advertise that as lose weight in 60 days and, make a plan around it. But it is definitely a lot more effective if the aim is long-term weight loss, which is, I would argue, most people's issue.
And I'm sure there's a huge behavioral change component there too. It's very easy to do something drastic for a short period of time.
Yeah.
Think about these television shows like The Biggest Loser.
Yeah.
Right? It's not easy. It's still a lot of hard work. But to keep up that same regimen of working out or dramatically cutting calories for the long haul is a lot tougher. So I'm sure as part of what you were just explaining there, one of the aspects is the behavioral aspect of being able to stick to something consistently to improve your body composition, whether it's adding muscle or losing weight or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Which, nutrition is one part of it, but of course goes back to what we were talking about before. Exercise and working out is another part of it as well.
Totally. Yeah. And there are definitely there's the impact of sleep as well and stress levels. All these things can impact cortisol, your body's ability to regulate sugar. It has a huge impact, and there is definitely the behavioral impact of the hormones that judge satiety and your food seeking behavior, and I think generally there is a lot more to be had from tracking your metrics, and so this goes into the other thing that I think is underrated. Considering that I've just talked about the very basic things like exercise and diet, it might surprise people to think of wearables, things like Oura Rings or Fitbits or continuous glucose monitors. But I think for short periods of time, they do add a lot more color to how your body is reacting to things like exercise and different diets. And it gives you, what I've observed, behavioral change motivation. So when people understand, when I have that chocolate bar, my sugar spikes, and that leads to this cascade of issues in my body, and that might be explaining these results that I see in my bloods or this number that I see in my scales. It adds a lot more of that motivation to change said behavior. And almost, I'm reticent to use this word gamify, but the gamification of your health is something that can prove useful in the short term, and it leads to overall habit change. I've certainly noticed that myself. When I started tracking my sleep, I had a lot more onus to change things that improve my sleep. Things like not eating 2 to 3 hours before bed, things like not having alcoholic drinks too late in the evening, and things like making sure that I am not checking social media late at night. Things that I think are really, really hard to change, But with the motivation that I had from my sleep tracking, it was game changing. It was absolutely game changing. And a lot of people have noticed the same things with all the different wearables that give metrics to us and are a lot more accessible these days.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a big fan. We've done a bunch of episodes. I know you have too. So we can link to some of those below. Anything else in the category of overrated or underrated that you feel very passionate about right now before we move on to the next topic?
I think in the same vein as trying to opt into things that have multimodal effects, supplements I think are overrated in a few areas. So with the exception of a few, I always look at omega-3, vitamin D, iron, particularly for menstruating women, as things that we should definitely have checked and ensure that you're optimizing, because they have a huge number of different downstream effects. But I think targeted specific supplements before you cover the basics can be overrated. And the reason why I say that is because I've had a number of instances where people have come to clinic and they've used a particular supplement in the hope that it will reduce their blood pressure or it will reduce their sugar spikes, for example. And they're not doing the basics. They're not getting the basic things right. They haven't changed the diet. They haven't made a considered effort to improve lean muscle mass, for example, so you can better dispose of your glucose when it's in circulation. Those are the things that are going to have drastic effects, not the supplements. So whilst I appreciate that, there are some studies and there are certain supplements that can have benefits. I think people try to jump to the supplement route a little bit quicker than is otherwise advisable. And I'd always say, let's start with the underrated stuff that we talked about first before we get to the stuff that I think is a lot more downstream.
Yeah, it's almost like supplements are suffering from the same challenges that, again, there could be a place for them. And you talked about some of the basics, but people treat them like they want it to be a drug. They're not as powerful as drugs.
Yeah.
Obviously, they don't have the side effects in most of the cases that are there, depending on what people use. But they want that sort of drug-like effect. And marketing can play a huge role inside of this. You know, people are making money by talking about it. And again, there can be some great supplements that are out there.
Yeah.
But that can put us into the wheelhouse of this is that pill for my ill, the same way that people think about certain medications as being the ultimate answer. And the interesting thing about it is that even for some of the supplements that are out there that have, and you're having more and more companies now, it's starting to do like, clinically validated supplements that they're bringing to the table. And that's great. We want more science. And obviously there's a degree and a spectrum of like what is really strong science versus what is, basic sort of proof of concept study. What was interesting is that we had on Dr. John Abrams on the podcast a year ago, and in his book called Sickening, which was a review of the pharmaceutical industry and how drugs come to development and clinical trials and behind the scenes. And Dr. John Abrams he's a professor at Harvard. He's been he's a medical doctor. He's a professor. He's been an expert witness in some of the biggest trials in America that have been about recalling certain drugs on the market. And one of the things that he was trying to help people understand is that even for pharmaceuticals, right, we have to have the same scrutiny on, supplements too, and there's a lot of marketing, and most of them are not going through any kind of clinical trial. Like, let's just be super clear about that. But even with pharmaceuticals, and this relates to supplements, I'll tie the dots in a second, we often don't realize that many of the studies that are being presented out to doctors and the public in America, ads all over the TV and news about drugs, when they're talking about this drug has an X percentage drop and this person improved whatever disease or condition, the studies that are being done are never looked at, well, compared to what? And often when it comes to lifestyle recommendations, doctors are given the sense that this drug is the ultimate option and intervention. One of the ones that he was talking about was looking at even drugs like metformin, right, for diabetes control. And he talked about, we wrote a whole thing about this. He talked about very little public funding goes into the contextualization of like, okay, great. How does metformin work on its own? How does it work with diet and lifestyle changes and modifications? And then how do diet and lifestyle modifications work on their own?
Yeah.
And there was a study that was done exactly on this.
Yeah.
And it came out, I think it was like in the 90s.
Yeah.
I don't have it in front of me, so I don't have the reference, but we can link it again inside of the show notes. Jumping to the end point of it is that yes, metformin, which again, a lot of doctors use as a place that's out there, is an important part of, treating diabetes and everything. But metformin on its own worked X amount. Again, don't have the numbers in front of me, but we'll pull it up. Diet and lifestyle and metformin better. But even for these broad spectrum of patients, these weren't wealthy patients or anything like that were part of the study. When they had lifestyle changes alone, a simple working out regimen, right? I think it was like 100 minutes a week or something like that, plus some basic dietary modifications. That was the biggest improvement that ended up happening.
Yeah.
So just remember that when people, we all know that phrase, like if exercise was a drug, it would be the best-selling drug in the world.
Yeah.
Same thing probably goes for sleep and a lot of these other quote-unquote soft interventions we're talking about. They work far better than many of the things that we're getting marketing to. Of course, it doesn't mean that there's not a place for those, especially drugs, which are an important part of it, but it's something to keep in mind that it's not talked about enough. And maybe one day we'll have the science that is able to look at the comparative studies so that people actually know, hey, look, if you just worked out a little bit better or ate a little bit better, we would have the science settled and said that works even better than this drug, which great, that could be an option for these other folks.
Totally. Yeah. I remember that study you're talking about because I think I read that paper and that flipped my cognitive dissonance on its head. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm sure you'll link to it in the show notes. There is another study that was done a little bit more recently that proved a very similar effect. I think it was called the Diabetes Prevention Program, and it pitted diet and lifestyle against some of the early pre-diabetes drugs or drugs that we use for metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, metformin, against that. And it had a similar, if not greater effect than the pharmaceutical. And you're right. I think it definitely comes down to people's expectation and idea of diet and lifestyle being a softer effect, where in actuality, they are as good, if not better, than the current drugs that are seen as the harder interventions. And it comes to this point of cognitive dissonance that I just mentioned there. The cognitive dissonance, just for the listeners, is this sort of uncomfortable feeling where you have a particular bias towards one thing, but evidence to contrary it. And so you have to make this choice between choosing what is very clear and evidence-based in front of you versus your inherent bias. I'll use a crude example. So a smoker who understands that smoking causes cancer and has a risk of all sorts of different conditions has to prove to themselves that smoking's okay for them, because they either underplay the risks or overstate the benefits of smoking. It relaxes me. It's a social thing.
Helps
I don't
me lose weight, whatever.
Yeah, it helps me lose weight. I don't smoke that much. That is a prime example of cognitive dissonance. And I think the same thing within medicine, and I'm not speaking for all medics here, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think there is this expectation that drugs are more powerful than all the other lifestyle and diet tools that we have. And when evidence is produced to the contrary, we have this uncomfortable feeling whereby, well, we don't really know that much about diet and lifestyle. How do we actually get people doing that? It's probably not even that effective anyway. So I'm just going to go down with the drugs route anyway. That is a prime example of cognitive dissonance that we see in medicine across the board. And I think there are lots of parallels with different drugs, different conditions, different specialties that we see. I mean, we even saw that in cardiology, I think, with primary coronary intervention, until we had the study that demonstrated it wasn't having a big enough effect to prove that we should be doing that, and we should be doing other things. People were still doing PCIs inappropriately. So yeah, there's a lot to be said around that, and there are a lot more studies that demonstrate the impact of diet and lifestyle that we need to sort of change the tuning on for medics in particular.
Totally. And it brings up this whole thing of incentives. Who's going to fund it?
Yeah.
Who's going to put resources around it? These big studies are few and far in between. And it does seem that we need, the ones that have been done. And I feel like people have told me, I'm not an expert on it, but that there might be some more resources percentage-wise in some European countries that are dedicated around public funding of some of these bigger studies. In America, obviously we have our NIH, but it takes a shift of culture to get resources put in that direction.
For sure.
And, they're tough and they're expensive.
Yeah,
they take a while to do.
And if you think about those funding bodies, if they suffer from the same disillusions of interventions that are harder, being pharmaceuticals or surgeries or other sort of interventions that we typically think of as medicine versus diet and lifestyle, where are you going to direct public funds towards? Well, you're going to go for where your biases are. And away from the diet and lifestyle things, which is why you see it chronically underfunded, usually under the banner of nutrition studies being too expensive to run, particularly for the long haul. And I think that's incorrect. I really think that studies whereby food is provided, cooked fresh, let's say delivered by a ghost kitchen or a cloud kitchen, or maybe even in the form of a meal box and given to participants or families or wherever it might be, is something that should be relatively simple and affordable to conduct a study around. And actually, we're seeing this. Charities are actually doing this. We'll probably talk about it a bit later. But prescribing fruit and vegetable pilots are actually happening in the US and certainly in the UK.
I saw one of the ones that you highlighted on your Instagram account.
Yeah. And I think, when you have a podcast and audience, what we have is this lovely spotlight. And what I'm trying to do with my spotlight is just shine it to illuminate the great work of charities and what people are doing. And one of them is the Alexandra Rose charity that's been around for about 100 years. And they've started a pilot with some underserved families in different areas across the UK, literally giving them a voucher that enables them to buy fresh fruit and vegetables from local markets. It has a whole bunch of secondary benefits to the economy and all the rest of it, but ultimately they're increasing fruit and vegetable consumption amongst the patient population that is eligible for these vouchers. And the early results are pretty phenomenal. Improvements in bowel habit, improvements in fatigue, improvements in sense of well-being. These are things that you can't put a price on, first of all, but you can't really package into a pill either. If I had a pill that improves someone's digestive habit, improves someone's sense of well-being, their happiness levels, we pay like thousands for it. But this simple intervention that is really, really affordably run right now is demonstrating those benefits. So that's where we need to be funding a lot more research.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's I don't know too much about the state of sort of UK politics and your equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the US. People are shocked to realize that, for example, our Food and Drug Administration, the more you dig into it, and I'm sure there's incredibly well-meaning people there that are doing a great job. I know there is. And you can't deny that, the public accounting of it shows that 60% of the funding comes from the corporations that they're policing, with the heavy emphasis on pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
That's going to have incentives and approaches. Now it comes through approvals and fees that people have to pay. But again, you have a government body where 60% of their funding is coming from the group that they're governing.
Yeah.
There's going to create some sort of incentives along with it. Then, not to mention the political revolving door. Right?
Yeah.
You're at the FDA, and then those individuals, they leave and they typically go and they work at pharma. And there's a revolving door, and it's understood, like a lot of things in the US. So you end up having this echo chamber, even if people are trying to approach it a good way, where it's like people are lazy. They're not going to want to implement these things. We need to come up with solutions and promote. We need to start developing and devoting a lot more funding towards things like how do we get Ozempic and these other GLP-1 drugs to kids?
Yeah, I know.
How do we get them to every single adult that's out there? Because, we already know people are not interested in, diet and lifestyle. But it all comes from this sort of echo chamber that you're in of hanging out with people who only look at the world in that particular way.
Yeah.
And one of the nefarious things, just to put it out there, because I've talked about it before, referencing back to this book, The Sickening, it starts off in the opening chapter saying, one of the things that very few people understand, including medical doctors globally, this is not just in the US, is that when they're presented with a study on a pharmaceutical intervention, and we talk about studies being peer-reviewed, the editorial board of these journals, including some of the early groups that peer review before it's published to the larger public, or for that particular journal, whoever subscribes to it, they don't get access to raw data. In almost every single case of a drug being looked at, right? Even as controversial, this is a whole other topic, as, the efficacy of vaccines during COVID. Right? They do not get access to the raw data. The raw data is considered intellectual property. They get access to the drug company's interpretation of the raw data and then presented. And then anybody who knows a little bit about that knows that not every study is published. The studies that show favorable outcomes, are the ones that end up getting published. And in some cases, when it's government funded, they will still publish the study regardless. But if it's pharmaceutical driven, they don't always have to publish, and they don't always have to tell you that they didn't publish that. So most peer reviewed is not actually the raw data to look at the entire collection. It's actually sanitized data through the drug company's lenses. And it's only in some extreme instances when some big drugs are taken off the market, or potentially there's court intervention and those companies are sued. In the rare instance, that intellectual property, that raw data, comes out in court. This happened with, there was a very famous case, I'm blanking on the drug, but Vioxx. Vioxx, I don't know what you guys call it here.
I don't know what that is.
I got to look it up, because I'm just going to bring it up here. But the equivalent of it, but Vioxx.
Was it ranitidine? Or
is rofecoxib?
Oh, it's a chelecoxib.
It was
COX-2 inhibitor.
Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was a big deal. This drug was around in the US and available globally, and was pulled off the market.
Yeah.
Because of safety concerns.
Yeah.
And this Dr. John Abrams was one of the lead individuals that was part of it, that was publishing early articles and questioning the peer review and protesting to get access to the raw data, because there was an association, I think in particular for Vioxx, that this drug was leading to excess heart deaths, right? Cardiovascular issues that were there.
Yeah.
And it was only in trial that it came out, and ultimately the drug was recalled. And I don't remember who was, whether it was Merck or Pfizer. I think it was Merck that was behind it. Had to pay like one of the biggest fines in the history of pharmaceutical industry. But it only in trial did it come out that the sanitized version that they put out there, intentionally at the time, and again, this is just, this is an extreme and probably, I would hopefully, a more rare example, but just highlighting again what is available, what people have access to, and this idea of what works better. Does drugs work better? Does it, food and lifestyle interventions work better? It came out in the trial that's the pre-sanitized version had showed all these instances of individuals who had these cardiac events that were there, but they were considered and kind of shelved and put under the context of outliers. Anyways, the book's sickening.
I got to check
people can look
that
it
out,
up and check
sure.
it out.
Yeah.
But this all goes back to this idea of, I think people are waking up through independent media, long format media, social media, individuals like yourself that are speaking and saying, this doesn't have to be hard. it can be fun, and you're going to get better results across the board when you invest into it. Is it tough initially? Yes. Anything worthwhile doing is going to be tough. You want to start a company like you're doing, it's going to be tough.
Yeah.
Right? But guess what? Life was tough.
Yeah.
That's where we came from. We didn't have indoor plumbing. We didn't have food abundance all around us. Like life was actually tough.
Yeah.
And I have a phrase that I share with my men's group, which is like, it's either you kick your ass or life is going to kick your ass. But life is still going to kick your ass. It's just you're better prepared for it if you kick your ass first, right? Anyways, that's my monologue.
No, that's great. I mean, I've got to look up the raw data thing. That's news to me. That's crazy.
More and more people are talking about it.
Yeah, I remember reading Ben Goldacre's book. I think it was called Bad Pharma many years ago, and it probably had some details of the issues surrounding peer review for sure. Sickening sounds like definitely a book I need to read. But I can definitely see the cracks in the processes that are meant to keep people safe. With the recent recall of ranitidine, I'm not too sure what you guys call it. It's a drug that we use for gastritis. It was so commonly used, you could buy it over the counter in the UK. We know it has clinically negative effects, in particular in cancer. Also, diclofenac, which is another anti-inflammatory drug that we used to give quite often for things like back pain and spasms, has similar impacts on the risk of myocardial infarction as well, which is why that is no longer being used as commonly as it was. We still use it in some rare occasions for pain relief in renal stones, but other than that, we tend not to use it because of those issues. And so, you want to take the path of least resistance. You want to go the easy route as much as possible. And I think more and more people are coming around to this idea of let's do the basics first before we entertain drugs that are wonderful and definitely have a use case, but we want to use that further down the line of management, because there are unfortunately a lot of unknowns, and they will only surface typically years in the future, not at the point at which it's offered to the public. And unfortunately, we do have really rigorous practices for releasing drugs into the market, but sometimes, like those examples, they, for whatever reason, whether it be nefarious or not, are just not recognized. And there was another point you made, I believe, around this, but I'll come back to it later because I've forgotten it.
Yeah. Well, I'll send you that book, Sickening. One of the things that they were talking about is that actually all the journals got together, and it was September. It was 2001, and the journals all got together and said, "Listen, we can't do our job if we don't have access to this raw data."
Yeah.
And they were about to publish, and they were working on this open letter to the pharmaceutical industry saying, like, we need access to this stuff.
Yeah.
And they were working on it. And then September 11th happened.
Oh, wow.
And then, so, obviously the world changed and everybody was sort of focused on that, and that kind of derailed and shelved.
Oh, wow.
And the pharmaceutical industry has only sort of increased its sort of might and power and other stuff. But even they recognized that we needed to do something about this, but it didn't end up happening. Hopefully, something ends up coming out of it in the future. But,
I remember my point now, actually. It's, here in the UK, we sit on our sort of like privileged chair and we look at America and we're like, oh, like, they've all got conflicts of interests. They have these lobbying parties, they can't get anything through. And we sort of look across the pond at you guys and we think, well, we're not that bad. In actual fact, we're pretty bad. And an example of this, going back to an earlier point you made about food and the conflicts of interest there, we've tried to get a junk food ban in the UK. So foods that are typically hyper palatable, ultra processed, and uniquely detrimental to kids' health in particular shouldn't be advertised. And they're generally advertised to the most vulnerable groups, whether it be via price promotions, whether it be via, sexy cartoon advertising that makes it a lot more attractive to kids or whatever. But that has been kicked down the road time and time again. I don't think the ban was meant to come into effect this month or later this month, and it's been kicked back into like 2025.
Wow.
And so the food czar, as
And it's a ban on advertising.
It was a ban on advertising, just a ban on advertising. And the food czar, a guy called Henry Dimbleby, he's been a food entrepreneur. He actually resigned last month just because there's just this insane inaction by the government in the knowledge of how detrimental these products are, in the knowledge of how effective advertising is, particularly to vulnerable groups and children, and yet this sort of like brushing over of these effects. And so, we're just as messed up over here in the UK, with our lobbying groups and big food. And like, I don't like to call out big food because, we start this conversation talking about how industrialization of food has led to some benefits, but at the same time, we have this huge negative effect that should be really recognized a lot more so by our political figures. Not to take this down the political direction, but I think that it's fair to say that we've got as many issues as the Americans.
Yeah, and to not acknowledge the political influence and to not acknowledge the role that big food would play, not in a way to say that I also don't think that if they changed everything overnight that they would be the answer, right? We have a population that's addicted to the way that things are, and that's usually their argument.
Yeah.
If we stop making this, somebody else is going to make it, right?
Yeah.
This is more about a collective effort to head in the right direction and being partners together to come up with solutions, but also, especially, in America, where the number one item consumed for people that are on the SNAP program, which is the food stamps program, the assistance program, in terms of calorie density is soda, then you have to ask yourself, okay, do we want government assistance to allow for this particularly concentrated form of a calorie, which we know is so much more harmful to the body and is so much more tied to obesity and diabetes and all these other aspects that are there, right? It's worth debate and at least acknowledgement, because I don't know how you feel about it, man, but I feel like, people sometimes ask me like, hey, is the world getting healthier or is it getting unhealthier? And it's like, it's actually both. You have this super small percentage of the population that is getting very healthy and also potentially has access to some of these resources, testing, and tools that maybe for the first time could add a few years of extra life to us, especially when you're talking about some of the latest technologies in early cancer detection and other things that can even help treat these diseases a lot earlier than ever before that we've ever, had. Not to mention maybe some of the more experimental longevity aspects. And then there's this other side that through, like the numbers and seeing that, you have the population of the United States for the first time, kids being born today are not expected to live as long as their parents. That's a combination of a bunch of different things. The opioid crisis, drug interventions, how the economy and social sort of economic injustice plays a role inside of that. But it's this split. And it's kind of like, if you look at a lot of these dystopian movies that came out, these sci-fi movies, that's the world that they talk about in the future. You have the haves that are living really long and healthy lives, and you have the have-nots, which is the majority, which is all the reason why we have to figure out how to come up with solutions that can meet people where they are and that aren't expensive, that have them lean into this. And, you're working on this, and I want to get a chance to talk a little bit about this. Because something has to be done. And the point that I was making here to connect the dots is that to expect that just by getting people who are already generally healthy, who have access to healthcare, especially in the United States, that are listening to this podcast, to eat a little bit more healthy, that's our way out of this. It's not our way out of this, right? Yeah. We need those people to start companies. We need those people to become politicians who get elected. We need those people to make changes in their school system, have those lunch. We need to have ripple effects from everybody who's listening in their own corner of the world in whatever way that they can. That's how we get closer to actually making a dent in this whole thing. That's
absolutely. And you know what, like, just for context for the listeners in America, like I have been a doctor in the NHS, the UK healthcare system, which is universal. At the point of delivery, we don't charge anyone. It's funded through taxation. It's a wonderful system. It employs 1.2 million people, which is one of the biggest employers in the world, top 3, I believe. But I became disillusioned because what I was talking about on my podcast and the people I was interacting with on my newsletter and all the rest of it were generally healthy, whereas the people that I see in clinic and in A&E and wherever I see them are generally people that would have no inclination to listen to one of my podcasts or watch a show with me teaching them how to eat healthy and all that kind of stuff. So there has to be a relevant way of engaging different people from different parts of society, different backgrounds, etc. And I think this also came to light when I started taking over hospital canteens at the end of last year. So I ran this pilot with a big MNC that has a number of contracts within NHS hospitals. Just a bit of context, we have about 250 plus large hospitals in the UK. A lot of those hospitals, their food that are being delivered to patients, as well as the staff canteens, are operated by one of these big multinational companies that many people would have heard of. And I did a pilot with them where I took over 5 of the canteens at different hospitals across the UK for a week at a time. We did customer surveys to monitor whether people like the food. And when I say completely took over, I completely took over. Like, we had like a veggie curry, we had like this chicken cacciatore, we had like a live salad bar that was made like live for the people there. We had all these really healthy options, got rid of the soft drinks. Like, it was complete sort of like overhaul. The customer surveys were great. Revenue actually went up. But there were a couple of things that we could not take off the menu because there would have literally just been a revolt. And it was chips or fries and beans, just Heinz baked beans, full of sugar, generally okay. It's got some fiber in, but pretty processed. And jacket potatoes. It's an institution in the UK. I'm not too sure what it's like in the US, but jacket potatoes.
Something like fried potatoes? Or
it's basically like a baked potato with the skin on,
okay,
and then you basically fill it with cheese.
Okay, got it. Yep.
And so I was sat there, helping people navigate the options and stuff, and chatting to people, and taking selfies and all the rest of it. And I was just watching what people choose, and at least 50% of people, no joke, would go right past all those wonderful, colorful, healthy options that are the same price and opt for the jack potato beans or the chips and beans. And look, I'm not judging at all. I'm not judging whatsoever. But I feel that people are predictably irrational for a number of reasons. When I say predictably irrational, I mean people will say they want a healthy option. People will verbalize that they want to get healthier, they want to exercise, they want to eat better, maybe improve their fiber content, but they will choose the opposite. And there are probably a couple of reasons as to why. There's probably an element of comfort. There's probably an element of cognitive dissonance that we discussed. And there's probably also the element of our tastes and what we're used to, and actually opting into a bitter flavored salad or a curry that is full of all these weird, wonderful ingredients that they don't recognize is something that is quite far removed from what is expected. And I think there is a chasm to cross before we can actually get people to eat in a way that is aligned with their health. And there is this, I think, misguided belief that if people are offered the right options at the right price point, that they will naturally align themselves to those options that serve their health needs. I think that is an incorrect assumption. It's something that I think
myself. It's an incorrect assumption because even for people who have resources and are very smart, education makes a huge difference.
Huge.
Right? Like, I don't know if you guys have seen it here, but in America right now, in the last probably more than I've seen it before, we used to have waves. There's so many more people that are basically saying I am either significantly cutting out my alcohol or I'm just deciding to go alcohol free.
Yeah.
And that used to pop up a little bit here and there. I used to be involved with this event called The Shine.
Oh yeah,
which you came to one of them before.
Yeah.
Founded by my dear friend Light Watkins, and it was sort of like a alcohol-free evening sort of variety show.
Yeah.
Right. And we used to host it in LA, and it was so popular. And there was all these articles that were written about it, in particular in the UK, like the Guardian, the Daily Mail. They all wrote about it, which was interesting. Talking about, wow, like is like millennials like, getting rid of alcohol and stuff. But last year, what was really interesting is Andrew Huberman, who many people on my podcast know. He's been on here twice, professor at Stanford University, researcher, and top podcast in the world, like not just in health, like just in the world, right? He did an episode, his episode on alcohol, and re-looking at all the studies saying that there was some benefit and talking about how there was no demonstrated benefit, not to say that there may not be social reasons that people drink, or people try to make arguments about blue zones, having small amount of alcohol in there as a hormetic sort of thing as part of their diet. But he basically went in and eviscerated all those studies, talking about why either they weren't done correctly, which goes back to, when I was growing up, people would say, you'd hear this advice sometimes, and, a doctor would go on TV and say, a couple glasses of wine a night, it's great. But by the way, if you're not drinking yet, we don't want you to start.
Yeah,
and it's like, what?
Yeah.
Like, how can you have both of those things to be true?
Yeah.
Anyways, that podcast was so downloaded globally. You saw this ripple effect as it kind of came out, and it kind of accelerated this movement that was already there, which is that all these smart people who actually genuinely just were not educated on the topic and just believed sort of the marketing and the narrative that was out there, they, for the first time through actual education, were like, oh shit, I've kind of been a little bit lied to, a little bit marketed to.
Yes.
And one of those prominent individuals, actually one of the top investors in the world, was Mark Andreessen.
Oh, wow.
And he wrote this whole Twitter thread about it, and then kind of turned it into a newsletter about how he listened to that podcast by Dr. Andrew Huberman. And he just was like, okay, like this is not working for me. He never drank growing up. For those not familiar, he is an investor at Andreessen Horowitz. They're big investors behind a lot of different companies, including like Levels Health, the continuous glucose monitor that I support. And he went into this whole thing about how he didn't really drink a lot growing up. And then whiskey, like a nice whiskey that he kind of like, sourced from somewhere, became part of his sort of evening routine.
Yeah.
And he actually enjoyed it, and he liked to get into the flavors and the origin and all that stuff. It was part of his ritual, right? And now that he's not drinking, he feels better, but he hates it. He hates it because this was the one thing in his life that he felt like was a little bit of an opportunity to kind of slow down and do something that wasn't kind of like work related and that sort of thing. But anyways, I won't go deep into that. I've talked about that before in a previous podcast, but even very people that would be successful or educated or have resources, you see when the right education comes to them and it's explained in a way. I heard you talk about this in a clip in a podcast that you were on. If we're going to present a menu to people and say, okay, hey, this food is low calorie and it's good for your cholesterol, people are not going to be excited about wanting to eat it. But instead, if you say, hey, it has these phytonutrients that are good for your gut metabolites, or it's going to help you sleep better, or it's going to help your immune system. When you make that connection, because I would say that probably a lot of those individuals, those hospital workers who are already sort of overworked in the first place, many of them on the night shift, they actually don't know that there's any difference besides maybe in some instances they would say that, oh yeah, eating this food might help me with my weight a little bit. Or in general, it's good to get greens.
Yeah.
Right? But there's not a deep understanding, even as somebody who works in healthcare,
100%.
about what those foods do for you. So I think that education is actually making a difference. It's just tough to do, but it is worth it at the end of the day because you really teach people how to change their worldview of things.
Absolutely. A couple examples of that to illustrate your point about the lack of knowledge, even amongst health workers. I every now and then do a nutrition and lifestyle workshop for my A&E department where I will go in and we'll have a little round table and there'll be like 20, 30 people. and it's usually made up of a mixture of the nurses, porters, everyone who works in A&E. Just go there. I do a little presentation, principles of healthy eating, interesting studies that I've come across, Q&A. And the Q&A is where you get the rich content, as you know, a lot of people who do talks will attest to. And again, no judgment. The lack of knowledge amongst healthcare workers around nutrition is pretty stark, and there's reasons for that. It's because we're not taught at medical school or nursing school about the impact of nutrition on health. And the other thing is, you know, just educating those workers not only has benefits to their own health, but it also will have a ripple effect on the patients that they look after as well. And just simple things like, one of the things that I was going to say is underrated is spices, because they're real concentrated phytochemicals. It has that hormetic effect, and it increases the flavor and the deliciousness of foods that I think everyone wants to have when they sit down to have a meal. I mean, it's one of the easiest routes to pleasure that we have in life, and it's something that we've evolved to absolutely love. So just teaching those workers about like how they can look after themselves, I think has a massive impact. And then, you know, I've had some of my friends who are not in healthcare who are educated, super smart people, you know, people like Andreessen Horowitz, who I haven't met yet, but Mark Andreessen rather. You know, when you teach them about the impact on cholesterol, or what cholesterol is good for, what cholesterol serves for you in your body, and how you can ensure that you're managing your cholesterol properly through things like exercise, diet, and the correct use of pharmaceuticals, it's going to have a magnitude of effect on their lifespan, and it will also ripple down to their network as well. So what you described with Andrew Huberman and that podcast having an impact on people's habits, I think is happening in a micro a way as well, with different people having these conversations and sparking more health journeys that through their own education. So it's definitely something that can have a big effect. It's what I'm obsessed with is scaling environments whereby health is the default. So we're creating salutogenic environments where the only option is the healthy option, or the default option is the healthy option. So instead of you having to pay an extra £1 or £2 for the healthy option, it's actually the cheaper option. That's the way we need to be thinking about health in this country and globally.
Yeah, I actually really think more private companies are going to get behind this.
Yeah.
And they're going to really start to incentivize their employees.
Yeah.
There were some talks about this. There were some rumblings that, you know, Jeff Bezos was working on something with Warren Buffett and insurance and taking a different approach. Who knows if that ends up coming back? But you're already seeing it with a lot of startups in the U.S. and you're seeing this a lot of smaller companies inside of the U.S. But I think there's so much because health is become really cool and mainstream, in particular amongst like it's all I know I live in LA, but even when I pop around and travel different places, if somebody's working on a startup, if somebody's working on a business, if somebody considers themselves as like a high performance, you know, CEO, man or woman, right? But especially if they're under a certain age because they have exposure to independent media, podcasts, social media, like all they want to do is talk about health.
Yeah.
Right? That all they want to do is talk about health. These are the conversations that I'm observing, and I'm seeing a lot of them thinking about how do we make this a part of our culture and incentivize team members, because not just because it's the right thing to do, but they're seeing employees feel better, work better, and think more clearly when they have access to this stuff. So I have a belief that we need to hit it from all different places, but I think in America in particular, for good or for worse, I think a big part of it's going to come from the private space.
I agree. Actually, I think, you know, the startup buzzwords that you're witnessing these days, and I've seen a whole bunch of pitch decks, is health, sustainability, impact. Those are the three words and AI obviously, but it used to be like, you know, Web3 or whatever, but those are the key words that you always see. And I heard this on a podcast with a friend of mine recently, where they described every company as morphing into some health derivative or health company derivative. So whether you're an airline, what's your health strategy? If you're in a financial institution, what is your health strategy? You know, even if you're a railway company or, you know, someone who is in any way related to food, you've got to have a health strategy there, whether it's for your employees or whether it's for your customers that you're serving. There has to be some health strategy embedded in your company articles. And you're seeing this play out in a lot of ways. I know some financial institutions are offering their clients access to a health platform, whether it be discounts on gyms or whether it be, discount to healthy meal kits or whatever it might be. There's definitely rumblings of this that you can see, and that's coming from the private sector. It's not coming as much as it should be from public, particularly in this country, but you're going to see that play out, I think, in private.
Before we talk about your app and some of the things you're working on, because I think it's really exciting, I want to just touch on, because it's been a while since you were on the podcast previously. We talked a little bit about your origin story there, but I think it's worthwhile for people to understand your background of what really drives you and why the whole idea of food being a major part of medicine, and that food is medicine, is so weaved into your ethos and DNA. So let's talk origin story a little bit and take us through it.
Yeah, sure, man. I mean, like, I come from an Indian background, as you know. Parents both grew up in Indian households, and you have those traditions, those Ayurvedic sort of influences from both sides. When I was younger, what actually attracted me to the idea of medicine was when my mum actually got ill. So she used to suffer from random attacks of anaphylaxis. They were idiopathic. That's a medical term for we don't know why you're having these attacks. And it could happen anywhere. Sometimes she was out clothes shopping. Sometimes she was just at home. Sometimes she was at dinner, and she would have this really aggressive attack. And for those who don't know what anaphylaxis is, it's the severest form of allergy where your blood pressure drops, your heart can stop, your throat swells, you can't breathe. And the way we treat it in medicine is with adrenaline or an EpiPen, if you have one. And seeing my mum go through that and seeing a whole bunch of different immunologists, having all the tests, was a pretty traumatic experience for everyone, I think, in the family. But what attracted me to medicine in the first instance was actually how my mum overcame that. And she used a food and lifestyle approach. So she was really ahead of her time. We're talking 25 years ago. She essentially put herself on an elimination diet where she was just eating foods that she recognized would not trigger her symptoms. And so she had to go through a whole long list, and it would be everything from high histamine foods, things that we might recognize now as high lectin foods, even certain animal proteins as well. I remember she would just have steamed fish, greens, and I think some short grain brown rice, something like that. Very, very simple diet. And it would take her a couple of months to reintroduce foods gradually, such that now she can eat whatever she wants. She also started doing things like yoga, meditation, trying to impact her stress levels, bring that down to an appropriate amount. There were a number of things that she did. And this is going back when I was 11 or 12, right? So I was just a kid at this point. But seeing her overcome that and come off all of her medications and not have to use her EpiPen once a month, that was the general course of how she was using it, was pretty phenomenal. And that attracted me to this idea of helping people heal themselves. And my parents were both, this is very unusual for Indian parents, but they were both against the idea of me going to medical school because they were both business people. So my mum had her own business. She worked in banks. She was a trader at one point. My dad started his company almost 40 years ago, worked his way up from scratch. Both entrepreneurs, both hustlers, both recognize that whilst medicine as a profession is attractive and it's reputable, it's harder work for less outcome. And maybe there's a difference there between the States and the UK, but that was definitely their opinion back then. So
you're the only Indian parents in the history of humanity that didn't want you to be a doctor.
I know, right? Yeah, it's crazy to think about that. I mean, they were happy when I got into medical school, and obviously I made that choice. But initially, they were pretty cautious to say, you sure you want to do this? You want to make sure that you're 100% committed. It's a lot of commitment. So I had those conversations. I got the grades. I went to medical school, but I promptly was sort of educated out of what actually attracted me to go into medicine in the first place. What I was fascinated was this ability of the body to look after itself, this innate ability for it to reach a state of homeostasis where it can rid itself of allergies or inflammation or what my mum was going through. And what I was taught, and I'm not regretting this at all, was a very conventional model of looking after someone with pharmaceutical surgery. And I was definitely, I don't want to use the word indoctrinated, but looking back on it, it does feel like the only model of healthcare that I was exposed to was one of pharmaceuticals and use of traditional interventions that we have today, which are phenomenal, absolutely amazing. I work in A&E. I use drugs all the time, not personally. I see the benefits of this within primary care as well, and community medicine, family physician for American listeners. But I was reminded of what attracted me to go into medicine in the first place when I got ill myself. And so when I qualified around 15 years ago now, 3 months into the job, I was working busy shifts, night shifts, long stretches. I was eating hospital food, which is like sloppy canteen food, like mac and cheese and cereals and sandwiches. That is a quote unquote normal diet, right? There's nothing abnormal about that. And junior doctors and residents across the world are eating a similar diet, having a similar pattern of circadian rhythm disruption, stresses, all that kind of stuff. But my threshold for illness is clearly a lot lower than my counterparts. And what I started suffering was atrial fibrillation. For those of you who don't know, it's an irregular heart rhythm that in my case was very fast. It was 200 beats per minute. One of the first times I had my episode was whilst I was working on the wards. And I remember I spoke to my registrar at the time, and I said to her, "Would you mind feeling my pulse? I feel I'm going a little bit fast at the moment." And within half an hour, my bleep was taken off me. I was stripped of my clothes. I was put into hospital clothes and hooked up to a cardiac monitor. And that was my first episode. I was given some medications to slow down the heart, put my heart in the right rhythm. I never needed an electrocardioversion, which is where you essentially shock the heart into the correct rhythm. But I would have these episodes once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week, lasting anywhere between 12 and 24 hours. And so I became a patient, essentially. Whilst I was working, I was seeing cardiologists, I was taking medications, I was having all these investigations looking at why a previously fit and well 24-year-old was having these untriggered attacks. And I try to really look at my food diary and look at what things could be causing these episodes. I came completely off alcohol. I wasn't drinking coffee at the time. I didn't have any infections. None of the typical things that would lead me to have atrial fibrillation were there. And when they looked at the structure of the heart, it looked completely normal as well. So all the reasons as to why someone might be suffering with an irregular heart rhythm were absent. And I was offered something called an ablation, which is typically a well-received procedure. You put a guide wire into the heart, you use a laser or cryo to burn an area around the pulmonary vein, which is where you have these misfiring cells that can lead to these aberrant rhythms. And I was 100% going to go for that, right? I'd been speaking to a number of different cardiologists. My girlfriend at the time was like getting me to load up on warfarin before I had my procedure. She was marching me down there. I was speaking to all my friends at the time, were like, you're a good candidate, 24-year-old, like, just have it done, be done with it. There's a very small chance of recurrence. Actually, now looking at the data, there is a higher chance of recurrence than previously thought. But I was 100% going to have this procedure, right? And it was my mum who suggested to me that I should really look at my diet and my lifestyle before I entertain something as aggressive as an intervention like that. And, the side effects of an ablation procedure are relatively low. But when you look at the numbers, 1 in 100 people might have damage to local structures or an infection or an issue on the table. There is a small chance of stroke. And these are things that you have to weigh up, and you never really think about it unless you're the person being told about these risk factors. And when you are, you're like, it illustrates it beautifully for you, because as a doctor delivering that information, it's like, it's a low risk. It's less than 1%. It'll be fine. But as a patient, you're like, well, I don't really like those odds. And is there another way? And that's where I got my first dose of empathy, actually, real empathy, really understanding what that patient journey is like, because it's very different when you're on the other side. And honestly, to appease my mum, I decided to change up my diet bit by bit, think about some of the things that she was talking about that had worked for her in a completely different scenario. I didn't think it was going to be, anything related to what she was doing, or it would have any bearing on my particular issue that I was being told was just a freak incident or freak reaction. And so slowly, I started changing my diet. I started off with removing my cereals in the morning and introducing oats and nuts and leftovers from the dinner the night before. I had a lot more greens in my diet. I had a lot more plants in my diet. I was inadvertently adding a lot more diversity. I stopped eating from the hospital canteen. I started meditating. I started doing yoga instead of my long runs. All these things I added up, added. And I was meticulously tracking my episodes. And I remember looking through my tracking, it was like, it's been a month. And then that turned into 3 months, and then that turned into 6 months. And I remember at 6 months having this conversation with my cardiologist. I was like, it's been 6 months. And I didn't think at the time, I didn't have the confidence to speak to my cardiologist about all the changes I was making. And so they didn't really appreciate what I was up to. And they said, look, just come back in 6 months. You're probably going to need to have the ablation. And I never did. It's been 14 years now, 13 years since I've had my last episode. I still see my cardiologists. I still have my investigations. I still track my numbers and everything. But that was the first dose of the power of food and lifestyle for me, and what triggered a deep dive into A, how on earth is this possible? And B, why wasn't I taught this at medical school? And that opening the door to more open, honest conversations with patients led me down the route of, okay, can diet help improve someone's arthritis? Or can diet stave off type 2 diabetes? Or can it improve one's risk of heart disease when they have it clear in their family? And I remember that to bring it full circle, the paper that you were talking about, the one in New England Journal of Medicine, I remember seeing that graph of metformin versus lifestyle, and just thinking, there's something here. There's definitely something here. And that led to this fascination around food, and parlaying that with my love of recipe creating. I would be running late in clinic because I'd be talking to patients about recipes that reflected their cultural heritage, that introduced the principles of healthy eating: more color, more fiber, more plants, more variety, more diversity, more whole foods, less processing. Simple things that got them thinking in a different way. And the benefits that I saw when we improved their numbers, when we improved their weight, or just their sense of well-being, even if there was no weight change, was phenomenal. And I've been addicted to that ever since, and that led to the Doctor's Kitchen, me putting myself out there on social media, and being a campaigner really for more appreciation of food as medicine, lifestyle is medicine, exercise is medicine, sleep is medicine. These are all just as powerful tools, not replacements for, but certainly things that lack the appreciation that we should really give them in medicine.
It's a beautiful story. And number one, first and foremost, shout out to all the moms that are out there.
Yeah.
I've met your mom. She's super sweet. And as recently as your wedding, which I was at, my wife and I, we had a chance to celebrate and sort of acknowledge the union of you and your wife. But yeah, your mom is amazing. And shout out to all the moms. There's probably a bunch that are listening that are trying to figure out a way to be that positive influence in their kids' lifestyle and life. Especially, it's so easy. I remember you talking about this, and you've talked about it multiple times, but in previous podcasts, how even when you got into med school, you would get into debates with your mom and try to prove her wrong. Like, Mom, there's absolutely zero evidence that any of these things work. These are all sort of our wishful thinking and home remedies from the, old days. This is not the way to approach. But, she did something which I think is very important. Again, whether you're a mom or a dad, a parent, or not even a parent, you're just trying to inspire people around you, which is see what she would just suggest to you. Oh, this is interesting. You should take a look at that, right?
Yeah.
When we come from any sort of judgmental place, like you need to do this or this other way of thinking is not really the way to go. This is a better way. First of all, people double down on what they were already doing.
Yeah.
Nobody likes to be told what to do.
Totally.
There's that inner part of us, the inner brat in every single one of us that feels like we don't want people telling us what to do.
Yeah.
So your mom definitely did some mental jujitsu
100%
there.
Yeah.
And really what it is, it's just authentic love, which is
Yeah.
that, hey, this is what I'm into. This is the difference it's made for me. You've seen my journey firsthand. Obviously, you witnessing your mom. It could be useful for you.
Yeah.
Another thing that you've also shared is that you may not know exactly how these changes of getting off of more processed and ultra processed foods and moving to more whole foods and cleaning up your diet, you may not understand all the mechanisms of how that exactly was contributing or alleviating some of the root factors that were related to your, AFib that you were dealing with. But you were also, we may not know that exactly now. Maybe the science knows that one day, but you were feeling better as well in this process. You're thinking more clearly. You're having a little bit more energy. When you're young, you can pretty much get away with whatever, and especially somebody like you who was working out, but you were trusting in addition to seeing, okay, there's more and more time that's happening in between these episodes that I would have of my heart racing. Sure, that's definitely proof. But it wasn't just that. You were noticing other differences and changes that were there.
Totally,
so,
yeah.
Yeah.
Just to double click on that point, I think I find myself in essentially my mum's position in a lot of cases, right? With patients, with colleagues, with loved ones, where I'm the one trying to expand their horizons and understanding of the impact of lifestyle and food. And you're right, it has to be A, coming from a place of love, and B, coming from a subtle nudge or a suggestion rather than this is the way, this is how you need to do things before you do X, Y, and Z. And I think if you do it the latter way, you bring out the natural antagonism that people have. And if they have firmly fixed beliefs, particularly medics, and I don't want to unfairly judge medics here, but when you're brought up in a particular establishment, you will fight to the death before you change your viewpoint on that. And I think that's something that my mum taught me, my own experience taught me. And the other thing is, you're right. When you're a younger person, a young adult, you feel invincible. You feel like, you can drink as much as you want, you can party as much as you want, you don't need to sleep as much. And I think there's this expectation, particularly as a medic, that you should be able to endure whatever life throws at you. And I think you saw elements of that during the pandemic as well, where there was this belief that it was doctors' duty to, and nurses and everyone else who was involved in the hospital, to go into work and put themselves in the way of danger in the same way a soldier might do in war. And I think there were lots of parallels that were being drawn, particularly on Twitter, between what we were fighting in hospitals and what typically people in the military do on the battlefield. And I think that was an incorrect assumption. And I think what I found through my own experience was the vulnerability that I had was my threshold for illness being a lot lower than my peers. And that led to a lot of frustration. And I had to really work through that to understand that, yes, I might be quote unquote weaker than other people, but this actually overall led to a lot of strength in my ability to empathize, in my ability to adapt, and a grander education that I don't think I would have had I not had that experience. I'd probably be a surgeon right now, and I wouldn't be talking to you on a podcast because I wouldn't have started my own, and we might not have ever connected. So there's a whole bunch of like sliding doors moments that I feel I've experienced as a result of that have really enriched my life and led to a strength that I don't think I would have trained myself to have.
Yeah, one of the other bigger outcomes that came out of that is that the recognition, going full circle to how we started off this podcast, which is that if we have these 11 million excess deaths a year that are deeply connected to an abundance of ultra processed calories and poor diet that's available to now most of the world, we have more deaths from overconsumption of food than we do from underconsumption of food. Right? That's a new thing in our modern history. How are we going to make a dent? And yes, we absolutely need the hospitals that are providing life-saving interventions in the final stages, especially doing their best to treat patients using the latest understanding that we have of drugs, medication, interventions that are there. And any doctor like yourself that has had this awakening with their own personal journey knows that if they could have gotten to that patient 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years earlier and taught them about some interventions that don't take any more time, might be a little bit tough in the beginning because everything new can feel a little bit tough, could even save them money and most likely will save them money in the long term and have them feel better along the way, that is another version of practicing medicine.
Yes.
And that's what you're doing now with your time. In particular, you're making a full-on switch of being primary identity as a doctor, which that will always be there as part of who you are and your training and your background, and now into a doctor entrepreneur who is working on an app to really be able to make this fun, easier, and more available to folks. Tell us about the app and what it is, and what you hope for it to become.
Totally. So going full circle, we did that initial research with the thousands of people on the newsletter, figure out what the health barriers were. We interviewed some of those people in my old studio as well to figure out, okay, how can we better help people do the real simple thing that I recognize as moving the needle on health? Increase fruit and vegetable consumption, increase fiber, and make it consistent. And we looked through multiple permutations. Is it a course? Is it a meal kit? Is it a delivery system? What is it? And what we figured out is a 3-step process. An app that educates users on the benefits of different foods. 2, one that automatically meal plans for them, taking into account their dietary preferences, their health goals, using an evidence-based approach, looking at all the nutrition science materials, looking at budget constraints, looking at the convenience options of like how they like to cook. And 3, integrating that such that it automatically syncs with their preferred online grocer and delivers the ingredients to them. So essentially it's like a meal kit, but at the price of a normal supermarket shop. It saves you time. It takes all the headache of like trying to figure out little Timmy doesn't like peas. He has a histamine intolerance. I need to look after my my protein needs, or I've got high cholesterol, and it puts all that complexity and automatically meal plans for you. That's what we're building in the future. And today I launched with an MVP called the Doctor's Kitchen app. We have 500 recipes. We have 5 different health goals: brain health, mental well-being, skin health, inflammation, general well-being as well. And we've done all the hard work for users. So we've already looked at the dietary patterns and ingredients that align with those different health goals. And you simply choose what recipes you like the look of. Every one of them has got step-by-step images, and you can build collections out of them. But we want to get to a point where everything is done for you, and you don't need to have the stress of trying to figure out from Google, what do I eat for? How do I, harmonize my meal plan such that our budget, our weekly expense is less than $50 or wherever it is. And we feel we can save people money, we can save people time, we can save people the cognitive load, and we can ensure consistency across their dietary habits such that it reduces their risk of disease. That's sort of like the plan and what I'm building at the moment.
Yeah, and like you said, the version of the app that's out, people can download it today.
Oh yeah,
even in America, I have it on my phone.
Oh, nice.
You can download it and you can start to pick some of these goals.
Totally.
And get recipes and prompts and everything like that.
Yeah.
And then you guys are going to continue to build. And this is the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah.
Is that you're putting a team together. Yeah. You guys are raising money and you're going to like really swing for the fences over here.
Totally, man. Yeah. Really swinging for the fences. It's like, my first time diving into the entrepreneurial world of raising capital from outside, bringing other people into the business. I've just hired my first CPTO, so Chief Product and Technical Officer. He comes from a consumer healthcare app background. So we've got lots of experience in that respect. And the vision that I'm trying to paint for investors is a world where it's easier than ever to eat well every day. And I think with new technologies coming out, it should be easier. Right now we have incredible vision over our finances. We've got the ability to do graphic design on our computers. We get delivery with food coming to us. Why is health food? Why is the ability of us to look after our health so lagging behind? And I think this is where the opportunity lies in the Doctor's Kitchen app.
Yeah, switching from the processed food world and how addictive it is, we have to create resources that are, as you mentioned before earlier in the podcast, they become the default and they make it easier for us to get into it, because behavior change can be tough in the beginning and is tough in the beginning.
Absolutely.
Right? And we're fighting against millions of years of human genetics, which are programming us to seek out the fat, the sugar, and the hyper palatable foods.
Totally, yeah.
And this is definitely one of those tools in the toolbox that can help people towards it. And I think that my favorite thing about this whole journey and this, not switching, but the evolution of being, primarily focused on being a doctor in clinic, working with people, to an online educator, to now all those things, but also an entrepreneur who's creating a platform for folks, is that you're documenting this process on this other podcast that you have too, which I've really been enjoying, by the way. I know you guys are on break right now, but you're going to be starting it soon.
Yeah.
Tell folks what that podcast is. And by the way, it's a must listen. You have a podcast on health too, right? Yeah. But anybody who's looking to create a business inside of the space, I've actually really been enjoying your new podcast and I've been listening over the last few months since you told me about it. What is that podcast? How can people follow along?
Yeah. So thanks for that, man. I appreciate that. I've been doing it with a good friend of mine, Jay, and it's called The Joyful Entrepreneur. We changed the name recently, and it really documents my journey as being a first-time tech entrepreneur, whilst at the same time being given guidance and mentorship by Jay, who's a serial tech entrepreneur who's raised hundreds of millions of pounds in the past, started like 4 or 5 companies. And it's a very no holds barred, honest look under the hood of what it's like to be a solo founder and starting from scratch. And I document, how I started the Doctor's Kitchen, the journey into podcasting, book writing, all the rest of it. We talk numbers.
How much do you make on a book deal? Like, 100%. What does a speaking event look like?
Yeah.
Like, how do you, do this, that, which I think a lot of creators, would be very interested in, especially if they're thinking like, I want to make a business out of my, career and interest in wellness.
Definitely. And I think, people are interested in this stuff, and I don't think it gets talked about enough, particularly in the UK anyway. I know in America, it's a little bit more open there, but I don't think we celebrate business or success in the same way over here. And, learning from Jay, him learning from me about the art of podcasting, about the art of being a creator, being genuine and authentic and bringing out your true self, is a really interesting dynamic. And plus I've known Jane for like years. So, me and him, we banter the whole time. We're always like telling jokes and stuff. So it's a very different type of pod to my typical one on the Doctor's Kitchen, where like you, I interview scientists and doctors, and I do solo episodes on like particular topics, whether it be insulin resistance or how to eat on a budget, or the latest in exercise or zone 2 training, for example. It's nice to explore a different element of creativity, and just give people a viewpoint on a different aspect of my personality in terms of entrepreneurship. So
I think the natural evolution for a lot of people in this space is that as you start to clean up your own diet, focus on your sleep, working out, these other things, you start to feel really good. But nothing makes you feel as good as feeling like you also can make a difference in other people's lives. So people naturally start to look at that. And there's different ways of doing that. People who are parents are thinking about raising their kids and how to make a difference for them, which is huge. We need that. People who are educators are thinking about, wow, how can I clean up my school's cafeteria or hospital's cafeteria, as you were mentioning before. People think about starting a nonprofit. And then this whole other category, which is, this conscious capitalism, which is how can we use capitalism for a force for good of creating more tools and resources and combine my interest in capitalism and also wellness and putting those things together.
Yeah.
And I feel like you're doing a great job of documenting that. I always look at like a lot of these entrepreneurs that I follow today who have created or sold big companies. And I'm like, man, it would have been great to know what they were dealing with in the beginning.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's kind of nice to see you build and document that journey all along. And I think for especially people who are listening here, who are they themselves interested in that category, it makes that world feel a little less lonely, because it definitely can be lonely.
Totally.
And it can feel like, oh, I actually am not only getting knowledge, but I actually feel like I'm relating to the experiences that somebody's going through. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate you starting it. I like the name previously. I think it was called Happy Millionaire, right?
Yeah.
But okay, Joyful Entrepreneur. Maybe it's a little bit more British. In the US, call it Happy Millionaire.
Happy Millionaire.
Everybody would be fine with that.
We're striving to be happy millionaires. Yeah. I mean, it's right. You're right. I want to look back on that pod in like 5 or 10 years time and be like, oh, that's what it was like. Because you always forget. You always sort of like look back with rose tinted glasses and thinking, oh, that was the good old days when it was just like one and it was exciting and all the rest of it. And one of my favorite favorite podcasts of all time was the podcast called Startup by Gimlet Media, where he documents his journey of creating Gimlet Media from scratch. This podcast company that ultimately sold to Spotify, I believe, for hundreds of millions, probably around 400 million. And he is a really famous episode where he pitches to Chris Sacca, one of the founders of Sequoia VC, one of the most successful VC firms of all time. And it's so cringeworthy to listen to. And honestly, you listen to it, you're like, oh my God, how did this guy make it with that
I've
kind
heard
of
that
pitch?
episode. I've heard it.
It's brilliant, right?
But that's the evolution of an entrepreneur.
Exactly.
You go in and you figure it out.
100%. And so I'm really enjoying that. I've been inspired by your journey and, the conversations that we've had in the past. So it's great, man. I'm hopefully I'm paying it forward by documenting my own path.
No, thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you for doing this podcast. This has been a fantastic opportunity to interview you in your home city. Tell our audience how they can keep in touch with you.
Sure. Yeah. So you can download the Doctor's Kitchen app on the Apple App Store. We are working on Android right now for Android users. TheDoctorsKitchen.com is where you can sign up to the newsletter, listen to the podcast, and reach out via social media as well. Always happy to hear from new followers and new listeners and new users of the app.
Rupy, it's been fantastic. I appreciate you as a friend. I appreciate you as an example in this world of being a creator, but also being open-hearted and leading with positivity to inspire behavior change. And I'm inspired about this transition into full-on entrepreneurship. Like you're really swinging for the fences. It makes me want to have my goals and dreams even bigger as well. And I appreciate that you're documenting along the way. I'm cheering for you, as you know.
Appreciate that,
and
man.
I'm excited for my audience to follow along with you as well.
I appreciate that, man. This has been my pleasure to be on this pod and for you to come visit us across the pond in London. I have to make the journey to LA soon.
Anytime. Thank you. Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
So it's not just about just eat this, eat this, eat this. No, I have to recognize that these people are addicted. And this addiction is a serious addiction. It's as serious as being addicted to morphine or any other